Welcome, everybody. Delighted that you came here to talk a little bit about what it is to manage and operate a Meraki hybrid network environment. And of course, when we say hybrid, we mean traditional Cisco on-premises, like the Catalyst gear, for example, combined with Cisco Meraki cloud-managed gear. So it's really, that's kind of the context that we're primarily talking about. Although, if some of you came to Cisco Live during June in Las Vegas, you were there for the keynote announcements where they also told us that the Catalyst portfolio is going to have the ability to be either monitored and or managed via the Meraki dashboard. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Of course, those feature sets are still kind of in development and release, so that's going to be a moving target for a while, but still very nice to hear about that. Before I really get fully started here, I want to kind of check that I've got real humans here. And the way I do that is I ask a question. And the question is really simple. Have you already tried to integrate a traditional Cisco on-prem and Meraki cloud managed gear? So have you been exposed to that environment yet? And so just in the chat window, yes, I've tried it, or no, I haven't. Just out of curiosity, looking for a little bit of a survey, I guess, right? About the exposure out there in the market of people who are actually doing this. And you should be able to send it to hosts. Well, actually, I think you can send it to everyone. I'm hoping you can anyway. And I'm hoping that you have chat. And if you don't have chat, then use the Q&A tool. Okay, yeah, then use the Q&A tool. We'll just pretend it's a question that you're asking. Yeah. All those special secret features that they enable for presentations, right? Yeah, feel free to use the Q&A tool. Okay, so we're getting a lot of no's. Just for those of you that probably can't see the Q&A, pretty much I'm getting no's. I'm looking for a yes, looking for a yes, looking for a yes. I do not see a single yes. So if you are someone who's done it, make sure to jump in there so I get at least one yes out of that. And again, everyone's decided to use the Q&A window as a way to give me feedback, which I'm perfectly happy with. I'm a bit of a chaotic person when it comes to feedback. It's like whatever tool works, just use it. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, about what integration looks like. And if you've never done this before, this is really good stuff to kind of know in advance before you have to do it. It's one of those things where you don't want to figure out integration after. Very, very bad sequence. So we'll talk about what the points of integration are, and it should be pretty obvious what those are. And then we're going to talk specifically about issues revolving around the MX, the MS, and the MR. Now, I will also say kind of the expectation here is that you're coming into the seminar, you kind of already know about Meraki, you've maybe managed and worked with it, you know the dashboard, you know the basic functionality, you know the product portfolio. And so there's not really a lot of ramp up on what those pieces are. I just kind of dive right into it. And hey, this is what the MX is going to do in route it mode, right? Is how we're going to have the conversation. So just a warning, and don't worry about it. If you are maybe brand new to Meraki and this is the first time, then just, enjoy, pick up what you can and continue your journey as you can and learn more about Meraki. So don't go away. If you are brand new, stay with us. This is fun stuff. So the points of integration. On the left-hand side here, what I have is kind of a traditional, campus network diagram. We've got an edge component with, in this particular instance, next generation firewalls. We've got a core component, which is where your traditional routed infrastructure could potentially be. We've got a distribution layer, which obviously we're going to be aggregating all of our access switches. And then, of course, we have our access layer and the access points, the wireless infrastructure connected to that as well. And it's just a kind of a classic diagram. And realistically, if you don't put any product numbers here, if you don't put any special icons, it could really be any switch, any router, any firewall that you're looking at in this diagram. Specifically, in the context of integration and hybrid operation, you can have a mixture of Meraki components and Cisco on-premises components anywhere within this topology. And it's feasible to get it to work. Now, there's certain combinations that'll obviously be easier and will be, a smart way, if you will, to do the integration. And then there's things that you can do to yourself that will simply just cause problems for you, and it'll create a lifetime of pain. And, the idea here is to understand what that looks like, avoid the pain, and embrace the good. A really, really, really simple initial way to start looking at this is at the edge of the network, which is the top of the diagram here. This is if you currently have, say, a firepower device, and you're thinking that you might want to migrate to Meraki devices at the edge, then obviously this is where the Meraki MX would come into play, because that's the edge device, right, for next generation firewall services, IPS, IDS, and security services, software-defined networking, VPN services. So that's one point of potential integration, is to maybe start swapping in Meraki MXs at the edge. Now, there can obviously be a transition time where you have a combination of firepower and Meraki devices at various locations, and you can coexist, for example, with IPsec-based VPNs if you were to do that. So that's just kind of like an example of what integration starts to look like in the real world. Now, you really wouldn't be replacing the core, right? If you've got Catalyst or Nexus routers, there really isn't a pathway where we say, oh, upgrade to this Meraki equipment. We really basically say, oh, that's really wonderful. I love that you have a Nexus core. I love that you have a Catalyst core. Let's keep that, and let's not move that out. Let's let it continue doing exactly what it was doing, because we don't really play in that exact role within the Meraki portfolio. And if your network is smaller, like many, many, many of your networks are, you don't need that anyway. You'll simply go to your distribution switches immediately instead of going through a core. And at the distribution switches, now we've got options. You can have a Catalyst switch there, for example, or you can have Meraki MS switches. And as many of you know, the Meraki MS switches are perfectly great at the aggregation layer. They do a great job of routing, traffic control, security mechanisms, and they have the feed speeds and port density that you might want to have at this aggregation or distribution layer. So you could potentially just swap a Meraki switches in right there. Or you could maybe look at your access layer. At the access layer, again, you can have Catalyst switches or Cisco small business switches or something like that that might be currently in place down at the access layer. And there's a wide range of Meraki switches that are suitable here as well. Now, the difference is primarily is that you probably don't want to care about routing down at the access layer. So you can buy the switches that are a little less expensive, don't have quite the same features as the aggregation switch, but have the port density and the speed and feed that you need for the endpoints that are connecting up to it. Of course, at the access layer, you're going to have to worry about things like the access control, so 802.1x mechanisms, for example. There are security capabilities because they're Meraki switches, and Meraki has security everywhere. There's traffic marking capabilities so that we can implement QoS appropriately. And of course, we have stackable switches, which is very highly recommended as a mechanism to deploy at the access layer when you have higher port densities that are required. Is really, we suggest that you go over to stacking. So that's another point of integration is, well, maybe I'll put Meraki switches at the access layer. Now you could have, and you could maintain your Catalyst switches at the distribution layer, and you can put your Meraki switches at the access layer if you want to do that. So you don't have to have a complete replacement. You can choose specific components of this diagram and say, at this layer, I'm going to implement this Meraki component. And of course, it's intelligent to do it at a specific layer, and to do it throughout the layer is kind of the easiest way forward, right, to do that. Now, the access layer can be a little, longer term project, because it might be that you're upgrading components of the access layer in a given time frame because of budgetary requirements. And you might just upgrade, one building first, and then the other buildings are still going to be Cisco at the Cisco on-prem at the access layer. You could do something like that. So you don't have to swap out an entire layer in one go, but you do have to be careful in how you do it, sequence it, and time it. And then, of course, also at the access layer, the Wi-Fi access points are very important. And it may be that you would like to implement Meraki as your Wi-Fi capability, in which case you've got great options, right, for Wi-Fi 5 and Wi-Fi 6. And of course, Meraki is cloud managed access points. So all of the Meraki access points managed via the cloud. You do not need a controller. there is not any integration between the Wi-Fi cloud managed Meraki access points and say a controller managed or Catalyst managed access point. So those two worlds are really separate worlds when you do that. Now there's things happening that are going to start changing that down the road, but we're not fully there yet. But right now it's two completely different worlds. So the coexistence in the wireless world, you have to be really careful how you do it, because there's no really easy way to integrate an on-premises wireless LAN controller with a Meraki cloud-based controller. Just really doesn't exist. So you have to think hard about how you're going to do the Wi-Fi migration if that's what you're looking at. And again, in the Meraki world, Wi-Fi 5, Wi-Fi 6 options, lots of security controls at the access points, and lots of capabilities to control who gets into your network and how you authenticate those individuals against your network. It's a very rich ecosystem on the Meraki side. And at some point, if you actually go to the ultimate and you completely convert over to Meraki, you get all kinds of interesting capability, of course, in a pure Meraki world in terms of visibility and troubleshooting and topology perspectives and views and management, and everything becomes easier when you're a pure Meraki cloud managed environment. But that may not be the end goal. So that's a really high level. If you only had 5 minutes or so that you could spend with me, that I just gave you 5 minutes worth of, here's a lot of stuff for you to remember. I'm going to cover it off in a little bit more detail in the slides that follow. So this is not the end of the presentation yet. And I'm going to just put my head over here for a second to see if any questions are popping out of anything I've said. I'm laughing because one of the answers I got was maybe. I guess maybe you've managed a hybrid environment. Maybe you didn't want to do it. Oh, I got a yes. I got a yes. Thank you. That was Ted. Thank you, Ted, for giving me a yes. By the way, you're the only one who gave me a straightforward yes. So good for you, Ted. I'm glad you did it. So, so that's kind of like a high level perspective of what we have to worry about when we do the integration piece. So, you know, there's many combinations, right? We could run the Cisco, look at the typo. We could run the Cisco enterprise equipment at headquarters, and we could do Meraki at the branches. That's a classic example. Happens a lot, in fact, that we do that. Or maybe you run Cisco at the edge for firewall. So you're running firepowers, for example. And you could still run a Meraki MX behind that if you wanted to do, say, VPN termination, right? You could still have a Meraki MX, and you could use it for, you know, a very specific use case. We could have Meraki MX inside of a data center for a one-arm VPN would be one of the use cases. You could have a Meraki virtual MX inside of an Amazon AWS environment, also doing one-arm VPN services that allow you to connect into your cloud environment from your Meraki SD-WAN infrastructure. You could swap out your Cisco Catalyst switches, particularly the older ones maybe that you might have floating around. And as you migrate and upgrade to Meraki MS. That's very feasible. A lot of the customers have chosen Meraki MRs as the mechanism that they're going to use to deploy very large cloud managed wireless solutions. I've dealt with and spoken with many end customers of Cisco Meraki, and 10,000 access points, 20,000 access points, 30,000 access points. There are customers out there with tens of thousands of Meraki access points. And then other than the access point, everything else is Cisco on-prem infrastructure. So they only use Meraki in the access points, and then Cisco everywhere else, or Cisco on-prem everywhere else. Sometimes you get customers rolling out Meraki Z series at the home office. As we went into the remote work ecosystem, the Meraki Z was a really beautiful, simple, straightforward solution. Super easy to connect it up to a Meraki MX at headquarters, and boom, you've got a really secure, easily manageable, fantastic visibility remote worker network infrastructure or work from home. So that's nice. And of course, for those of you that really do care about authenticating your users and maybe even traffic tagging and things like that, Meraki, of course, integrates very nicely with Cisco ISE, Identity Services Engine, for user authentication and control. So those are some of the examples that show up in the real world about what people are doing today as they mix and match and play around with the Meraki or introduce Meraki into an existing brownfield environment. So how do they successfully do that? Well, funny enough, you have to start off by identifying what your goals are, right? So are you looking for scalable branch offices with secure connectivity to headquarters? Are you looking for access to data center resources or cloud-oriented resources? You know, having some sort of very specific goal that's identified with, you know, with behavioral characteristics and or capabilities. And, you know, when we talk about those, are you going to do VPNs? Is it going to be IPsec VPN? Do you need to have OSPF or BGP? What about security? What's that going to look like? What about traffic shaping and QoS? Are you going to have requirements for DHCP? Who's going to actually run the DHCP services for you? What's your VLAN infrastructure look like? Are you integrating switches? What does the spanning tree protocol look like? You know, those kinds of questions. Are you going to do port aggregation? What protocols are supported for that? What kinds of mechanisms are available? Are there any restrictions, limitations, or caveats for any one of these capabilities that we just talked about? And as you know, yes, there are. Every single one of these have got something you should know before you try to integrate a hybrid environment. And I'm not saying that it's always dangerous, because very often things will just work and you'll be okay. But every now and then there's like, oh, I wish I knew that, because I would have planned differently if I had known that in advance. So that's where identifying your integration up front is so important, so that you can research the features you're going to implement and then look for the pain points. And again, as you can tell by the speed with which I'm talking, there is a lot to talk about. And this is actually what I think this is based on a 2-day class or a 3-day class. It takes multiple days to actually go through this conversation. We're just going to squeeze kind of a best of into our talk here today. And of course, once you've got those requirements identified, then you have to sit down and plan out your settings. You've got to run your tests and your trials. You've got to validate that your configurations are going to do what you think they're going to do. And then you have to roll it out, test it and validate it, and, you know, confirm it. And of course, make any adaptations as necessary to adjust to the reality of the world you find yourself in. So, you know, that's a really simple, straightforward approach to rolling out an integrated, converged, hybrid Cisco and Meraki network. All right, so let's do a little bit of a tour, right? We'll do MX, we'll do MS, we'll do MR. So we're going to kind of hit each of those 3 major food groups and talk a little bit about some of the things that you want to watch out for. So in the Meraki MX, remember, we can operate in routed mode or we can operate in pass-through mode, right? Those are the 2 major modes that we operate in with the Meraki MX. Now, the routed mode is a default mode. If you don't do anything to your Meraki when they ship it to you, it's going to be in routed mode from the get-go. So it's going to connect directly to the internet. It's typically designed to be an edge device. It'll have a public IP address on the wide area network side, private IP address on the local area network side. It's the point as well for network address or port address translation, really. It's the point of deployment for firewall security services and additional services like Cisco Umbrella would run here. Or advanced malware protection capability would run here, for example, right? Those kinds of things. And that's what's operating, right? When you have a traditional routed NAT mode Meraki MX. And this is just a reminder of what it's doing. So earlier, what we said is you need to identify the services that you're going to use. So what that means is that you would look at your Meraki MX and you would say, okay, we're going to leverage NAT probably pretty obviously. If it's going to act as a layer 3 gateway, this is definitely what you're doing. So we're going to be implementing NAT. And what's it going to look like? What kind of subnets are we going to use? Are we going to use static or dynamic routing? What would be the difference between static and dynamic routing? Are the dynamic routing mechanisms exactly what I think they are, or are there caveats that I need to know about them? What about the various firewall rules, right, that I'm going to implement? What about the VPN services? What about the site-to-site VPN services? And what about the remote client VPN services? What's that going to look like? And I'm not touching every single bullet here. I'm really just picking out probably some of the more likely bullets that cause grief, pain, and interesting configuration challenges are really the ones that I'm pointing out here. So all of those kinds of feature considerations, you need to walk through what's it like to implement this. And the minute that you start going, or the minute that you start having a Meraki MX at one location and a Cisco Catalyst or ISR or something like that in another location, that's where the complexity starts to show up. because, oh, you wanted to have a VPN, did you, between a Meraki device and a Cisco Catalyst? Well, if you want to do that VPN, you're going to have to do an IPsec VPN because the auto VPN mechanism will not work between that mixed environment. So that would be one of the caveats that you have to be aware of. And there's slightly different caveats if you're going to go for pass-through mode, because there's different functionality, right, that we're looking at in the Meraki MX itself. It doesn't perform any routing. It doesn't perform any NATing. It doesn't do any layer-3 firewall services. It's really a VPN concentrator. It's designed to help facilitate auto VPN, to facilitate site-to-site communication. That's its sweet spot, is to do that. Okay, it can support IPsec VPN, but the sweet spot is auto VPN services. And that will show up in how it, populates route tables, for example. So those are some of the things that you would have to care about a little bit on the pass-through. Now I'm going to dive into the VPN services because that's the most likeliest point of contention, right? So the Meraki MX supports a capability called auto VPN. Now this is it's based on IPsec, but it's additional special sauce that Meraki has added that makes it super easy to set up VPN tunnels between Meraki devices and other Meraki devices. There's a whole concept where Meraki devices actually talk to the Meraki cloud. They register themselves as a VPN endpoint. They identify some details about themselves, like the role that they're playing, hub or spoke, for example. We start figuring out who it is that they're going to connect to, what networks they're going to be advertising. And so there's a whole kind of centralized database of VPN configuration, which is maintained inside the Meraki dashboard. And that's unique to Meraki. And it makes it super easy to set up Meraki to Meraki VPN services. It's awesome, simple, and straightforward. Now, if you have a non-Meraki endpoint, then you have to go to an IPsec-based configuration for the non-Meraki endpoint. And you also now have to think more seriously about, well, how is the route information going to be advertised from one place to another place? If there's going to be routes that do need to be advertised, what's that going to look like? What protocols are available? And is it a two-way advertisement or is it a one-way advertisement? That rears its head immediately when you do not have Meraki to Meraki. So that's the main issue. So a few things to know about the MX-based VPNs. That OSPF is supported, for example, BGP is actually supported as well on the Meraki MX. It can support split tunnel as opposed to, full tunnel based VPN connectivity. And we can also support dual WAN uplinks, right? So that we have some redundancy, some failover, and some traffic sharing / load balancing, which really ties into the SD-WAN mechanisms that the Meraki MX is capable of performing. From a client point of view, the Meraki supports IPsec-based clients, and that was the only kind of client that you could connect up for many, many years. And what that meant in reality was, like on a Mac computer, for example, which is what I have, I would actually have to configure an L2TP tunnel on my Mac computer in order to connect up to my Meraki MX for VPN services. Now, easy for me to say because I know how to do it, but at scale and across a large number of end users, it's not so fun to have to do that, as many people recognized. And so recently, in the past year or so, they've enabled AnyConnect integration, and we can now integrate the AnyConnect client on the endpoints with the ability to connect to the Meraki VPN services for client purposes. And that's changed the game completely for Meraki clients. Finally, we're into a more managed type of infrastructure with a more consistent set of features. And I know that the vast majority of customers are much happier with the AnyConnect-based feature. So it's important to know that those two options are available to you. If you are thinking about doing client VPN, this is a serious consideration, and you have to plan ahead to purchase the licenses, of course, for AnyConnect, or you're going to have to figure out how to deploy IPsec-based settings to your endpoints. Now, If you use Meraki Systems Manager and you have policies defined within Systems Manager, that's actually one of the really easy ways to deploy the appropriate configuration for IPsec VPNs to endpoints. So it's a way out. But my experience is not that many people are using Meraki Systems Manager, at least in the US. It seems to be more popular in Europe. So probably in the US, you're not using Systems Manager. Now, you might be using some other competitors' endpoint management platform, which is completely fantastic. Then go ahead and use that tool to configure the appropriate IPsec and L2TP settings in your clients if that's what you want to do. If you are doing IPsec, the default mode is going to be full tunnel, but split tunnel can be configured if you want to do that. Right? And then you can just direct the traffic as appropriate through the VPN, but it's going to require a little tweak of the routing tables on the client device in order to do that. Again, because it's IPsec-based configuration and it's not AnyConnect, which is much easier. And of course, if you are configuring AnyConnect, then you can use the traditional endpoint management tools to configure the settings and parameters for that. So that's where your client starts to roll up, and it becomes important to figure out how you're going to do that. Now, if you are going to be implementing SD-WAN in the Meraki system, number one, it is not compatible with Viptela. It's not compatible with any other kind of SD-WAN that's out there. The Meraki SD-WAN is a unique animal in and of itself, and it will operate among other Meraki devices with AutoVPN and all the other services that we talked about. And it operates really incredibly well in that ecosystem, but it's not integrated with any of the other SD-WAN products or solutions. So this is one of those areas where you have to make an all or nothing kind of decision, or you choose some other strategy. Now, I do know customers of Cisco, then what they've done is they've implemented Viptela at the edge for SD-WAN services, and that's their global SD-WAN infrastructure is based on Viptela. And then in behind the Viptela, they have Meraki on the inside, and in through their network, they go Meraki. So they simply just decided Viptela is their SD-WAN provider or solution, and everything else is going to go Meraki. And that's perfectly acceptable, right, to decide to do something like that, especially for companies that maybe came from more of a legacy brownfield type of environment, and they were changing things behind the scenes, but they did not want to disrupt their WAN. That's what they've done. Now, of course, if you do go for the Meraki SD-WAN implementation, as you know, you've got two uplinks to play around with. You also potentially have a cellular backup capability. You have all kinds of options here from a load balancing point of view, and you have all kinds of options from a load, a traffic assignment point of view as well. Basically, you can do policy-based routing. You can identify at a very high level, layer 7, you can identify particular services, capabilities, social media networks, categories of websites and locations, and you can choose exactly how that traffic is going to go. You can choose the interface it's going to go over. You can choose any traffic controls, limitations, or restrictions that you want to. And so there's a whole world of mechanisms that allow you to get control of your traffic in a Meraki policy-based VPN/SD-WAN environment. So it's a very rich ecosystem, which is important to know, right? If you're thinking about committing to Meraki, you want to know that it's a very capable SD-WAN solution. Now, we mentioned earlier when we looked at the points of integration, and we stayed away completely from the concept of trying to swap out your Nexus or Catalyst routers. And the reason is that at least from the Meraki MX point of view, the Meraki MX, although we say it has route mode, Meraki MX is not a full-fledged router. So it's really not a good idea to think of the Meraki MX as a router substitute. The Meraki MX is an edge substitute. It's a firewall or next generation firewall / security device / SD-WAN / VPN device. This is what it does. It's not designed to be a full-fledged, full-on router that supports all of the critical routing protocols and all of the critical capabilities within those routing protocols. It's very limited in what it does. Ideally, in a Meraki MX in routed mode, you want to have a default static route that points to the outside world, or just a default route probably is how we say that. So a default route that points to the outside world, and then you want to have a static route that points to the subnets that are inside. And that's all you really want to configure manually. on the Meraki MX, and that's its ideal circumstances. And if that same Meraki MX does auto VPN, it will be informed of the other networks and how to reach those networks courtesy of the auto VPN settings. So you don't need to worry about that through any other mechanism. It'll just be done for you. And that's the simplest way to do it. And when you do the Meraki MX in that way, you do not even have to worry about enabling trunk ports on the Meraki MX. You simply enable an access port that communicates to a switch. You have a transit VLAN that's specifically for the purposes of communicating between the MX and your switch stack, or multiple for redundancy purposes. And then the switches are going to become the point of routing within the rest of the organization. And this is in a collapsed architecture, right, where you don't have that core routing infrastructure that we talked about earlier. You just go right from the edge to your aggregation layer or your distribution layer of your model. Then you run the routing protocols at the distribution layer, and you run all the VLANs at the distribution layer. And the Meraki MX is blissfully unaware of any of that. It's simply a point of security, a point of VPN termination, a point of egress and access, a point of security, and that's its job. Not doing any routing, like not doing any sophisticated dynamic routing. I think I'll say that. Not doing any dynamic routing is the best way to say that, right? It's just doing default routes and static routes. And that's, an important integration to know about. And there are only really a couple of types of routes. So I'm looking at the time, so I'm actually going to skip right to, I'll go to here. So I want to talk about this. So I mentioned the idea that the Meraki MX doesn't run full implementations of routing protocols. And the one that most people are probably familiar with is OSPF. And so the Meraki MX will advertise routes via OSPF. And the reason that it advertises via OSPF is because it's talking to a non-Meraki VPN endpoint. And it needs to inform that endpoint of all of the wonderful routes and networks that exist within the Meraki side network. And so it will advertise those routes via OSPF to the other side. However, it will not receive or process route advertisements that the other side sends it. Got it? It will not receive or process route advertisements via OSPF. So it will not listen for OSPF routes. It will only send OSPF routes, asymmetrical routing. And a lot of people don't realize that about the Meraki MX, that it does routing protocols, but it's asymmetrical for OSPF. That's an important integration point to be aware of. And now the BGP support is a little bit better, right? We support internal BGP and external BGP pair relationships for the exchange, the actual two-way exchange of routes. But what's really important is that we really only use the AS path length, right? So the AS path length is the only parameter that we pay attention to for BGP path selection. No other parameters are actually can be manipulated or interpreted or set or used in a Meraki MX other than the AS path length. So that's a big restriction in some environments, which means if you want to manipulate your BGP path selection process, you're going to have to stuff additional path entries into the list in order to manipulate it properly. And of course, that's easily done, but you need to know that you have to do it that way. So that's a BGP integration that comes up. And by the way, I'm glancing over here from time to time to my little question list, just in case anybody wants to throw a question at me. I am trying to look over to see if anything's coming through. So I skipped over a fair number of the slide there about routing because I'm looking at my time here. And I just want to kind of illustrate, in a normal Cisco catless router, for example, you would basically go, by the route priority, and you would choose which route to populate into your table based on the priority, the administrative distance, right, of that route entry, whether it was, OSPF, RIP, or, BGP, or static, or, manually directly connected, right? All of those would basically have their administrative distance, and you sort it out based on administrative distance. In the world of the Meraki MX, it's kind of more like it's similar, but it's like directly connected client VPN, static routes, auto VPN routes, non-Meraki VPN, BGP, and then NET. And notice that OSPF is not on the list. And the reason that it's not on the list is because we don't listen to OSPF advertisements, and so it doesn't show up here as a route priority. So that's really interesting, right? The way that this all works. So it's nice to know that about the Meraki MX and to know the order in which it selects routes. When you're troubleshooting and your root cause is based on routing, knowing this table and the order in which the evaluation is done could basically save you when you're trying to figure out what the root cause is if it's based on routing behaviors. Right? So something like that can be really helpful for you in surviving a hybrid environment. So that's kind of the MS piece of it. And obviously, you know, the introduction plus the MX took up, you know, a big chunk here of our conversation. But we've got about 20 minutes left, and I've got MS and MR to talk about, and of course, a little bit of business to do at the very end. So we're doing pretty good. Now, on the Meraki MS side, the things you want to watch out for are spanning tree, trunking protocols. We want to talk about the routing that's available on the MS world as well, along with kind of a collection of miscellaneous items, like the MTU, for example, or the link aggregation protocol that's supported on the MS networking side. So a couple of things to know about Meraki switches. RSTP is the default spanning tree mechanism. So rapid spanning tree protocol is enabled by default. And if you are operating in the world where your catless switches are connected into your Meraki switches, and you want to operate with PVST instead on the catless switches, then that's also possible. You just need to make sure that VLAN 1 is allowed on the trunks between the catless and the Meraki switches. And you want to make sure that your catless switches have got their priority set in such a fashion that they become the root switch, right? So set this catless switch priority to 0 so that it will likely become the root. Well, it should become the root unless you set that somewhere else. And so that's, you know, that's a consideration, right? Make the catless in a mixed environment, make the catless the root of your environment is typically what you're going to do. Now, that would make sense if your catless switches are the aggregation or the distribution layer. That makes complete sense, right? To do that. So, you know, use also your design thinking hat here. And this recommendation about making the catless the root makes sense if you have Meraki switches at the access layer and Catalyst switches at the distribution layer. Now, if you were to flip it and you were going to make a Meraki switch the distribution layer and you still had a bunch of Catalysts at the access layer, this is not good advice for obvious reasons. So you want to use the higher end models in the Meraki world, like the 410, the 425. Those would be good models to choose to deploy at the aggregation layer. They could become the root switch for you, and life will go on as normal, and you'll get good behavior if you are to do that. Okay. So this is a little bit of, you know, be careful what you do here. And of course, this is traditional recommendation. Keep the spanning tree diameter under 7 hops, right? Layer 2 hops, I guess, is really what we're talking about, so that we don't have to travel across more than 7 switches to get from one point to the other point of the network. Again, in a properly designed network, this should not be a problem. It's going to be a, you know, an unusually designed infrastructure that's going to break this rule, so it shouldn't be a problem. Make sure BPDU guard is enabled on the Meraki switches. Make sure loop guard is enabled on the trunk ports. Make sure root guard is enabled on the ports that are connecting the switches that you do not control administratively. And again, those kinds of recommendations are pretty generic. You know, they're just good practices no matter the kind of switch you're using, but you really do want to make sure you implement that properly on the Meraki switches. right? So a couple of other suggestions. Now, the trunk ports, of course, on the Meraki switches allow you to prune unnecessary VLANs, and it's so easy to configure that in the Meraki ecosystem. So if you do use this feature, you have to make sure, of course, that it's identical. It's got to be the same side or the same pruning happening on the Catalyst side as is happening on the Meraki side. And for the exact same reasons that we've always had forever, about why you want to have consistent pruning on two sides of a trunk port. Same thing for the native VLAN, making sure that that's configured consistently along with your allowed VLAN lists. Mismatches result in bridge traffic. Your life gets very difficult very quickly when you start mismatching configurations. The reason that I bring this up in this conversation about integration is back in the old day, when you had only Catalyst, you would open up one Catalyst config and look at it. You'd open up another Catalyst config and look at it. And you'd kind of do a, comparison of the configs and go, are they the same or not? And it was really easy to do the comparison because you're looking for the same commands with the same arguments. When you're doing Meraki and Catalysts, you've got a command line screen open with your command line for all of your trunk settings. And then you've got a GUI over here with a completely different perspective, completely different look and feel, a completely different way in which it represents the information. And now you've got to make sure that they're the same. So it's just a little bit harder to do that. Okay, so I'm just like letting you know that that can become a problem because it's not so easy to spot the difference sometimes when you have two completely different tools that are managing two completely different environments. So just be ready for that. When I go and I train students on how to do this, and they've only done the command line, there's always that little bit of discomfort that they have about, gee, this Meraki thing is really weird. It doesn't show me the information that I'm used to seeing it in, and it doesn't. So you have to get used to that. Another consideration is link aggregation control protocol is the only mechanism supported for link aggregation in the Meraki world. And you want to make sure, of course, that that's what's going to be used on both sides, right? Both the Catalyst switch side and the Meraki switch side are going to be implementing LACP. And also be careful that you don't have both sides set up to auto-auto, because as you know, with LACP configured for auto-auto, it'll never actually create the channel links, or the channel bonds will not be created, right? So you've got to make sure that one side, typically the Catalyst side, is set up so that it's actually going to force the link aggregation to turn on, would be the recommended mechanism, right, to do there for LACP. And most of us don't have to worry about maximum limits and things like that, but there are recommendations from Meraki that when you look at the total number of switches and switch ports in a network, so we're talking a network, not an organization. We're talking network. In a network, keep the number of switch ports to 8,000 or less. And it's not because we cannot support more. It's simply that the GUI gets slow when you have more than 8,000 ports. That's a lot of ports, but there can be some customers that get into that number. I'm just looking here for any other the key things that I wanted to talk about. Actually, there's nothing here that's absolutely critical on this slide. I want to jump to OSPF. So the Meraki switch supports OSPF routing, and it supports bidirectional OSPF routing. So, finally, right? So you'll actually have the ability to both send and receive OSPF advertisements. Now, there are some considerations. Basically, all of the interfaces are going to be using broadcast mode, and the hello and timers and the dead timers are the default 10-second and 40 seconds. And that should be exactly what the default is in your traditional on-prem Cisco gear. So that shouldn't be a problem. But if you tweak the timers on the Cisco on-prem gear, you've got to tweak the timers on the Meraki MS as well. Of course, we also, have traditional area 0 for your backbone area. We really don't recommend to have a large environment of OSPF areas when you start working with Meraki switches. Usually we say, you can have maybe 3 areas, maybe 4 areas that a single Meraki switch might be connected to. but they definitely do like you to keep the number of areas down as much as possible. Ideally, of course, you would have just 2 areas, area 0, and then some other area that you're supporting. We do not support virtual links. Now, virtual links don't come into play very often, but they certainly do show up when companies are merging or networks are being brought together that previously operated independently. What often happens in those environments is that you have multiple different OSPF implementations, you have multiple different area zeros, and then you have an integration problem of how do I bring all this together? And virtual links are one of the ways that you solve for that, and that's not supported in the Meraki MS. So it becomes a non-viable solution for certain types of problems. So just be aware of that. It's not a big issue otherwise. It's not a deal stopper for the vast majority of companies, but it's one of those corner cases where you want to know that it's not supported. The other behavior to be aware of, and this is not unusual, is that when you configure OSPF on a Meraki switch, it's going to instantly try to form neighbor relationships over over all the VLANs, which are part of the OSPF advertisement. And so if you have a trunk port between different switches, and there's 10 different VLANs going across that particular trunk port, then the default is it wants to establish a neighborship relationship across every one of those 10 VLANs. Now, routing for a VLAN versus establishing neighborship, it does not have to be identical. You can route for many, many, many VLANs, and you can establish neighborship over a single VLAN. That's a perfectly good configuration to have. And the reason that it's good is it shuts down the number of advertisements that have to occur, the number of SPF calculations. There's no end to the goodness of reducing the number of neighborship connections that you make in the OSPF world. So specifically on the Meraki side, just be aware that you will enable OSPF across all of your VLANs, and you'll enable passive on most of them, except for at least one of them, which will connect you to the other switch. And that's where you'll establish your neighborship relationship. Okay, it'll still populate tables. It just won't establish neighborship over the passive interfaces, or the passive VLANs might be another way for you to think about that, or the passive virtual interfaces, if you prefer that language. So that's another thing that you should look at. And I'm just popping over here again for a second to check out my chat window and see if there's any questions that popped up. Okay, so that's quieting down traffic in the OSPF world, in the Meraki world. Now, Meraki supports warm spare mechanisms for the Meraki switches, which really isn't used very much because the recommendation is that you should be stacking. Physical stacking is the recommendation in the Meraki world if you're looking for redundancy. And of course, you have dedicated stack ports that the Meraki switches support. You also have the ability in certain models to repurpose a port on the front panel as a stack port as well. There's really only one model that supports that. And we also have stack power capabilities. And so some of the features that you've become familiar with in the Cisco on-prem world, those features exist in the Meraki world as well. So it's important to know that, first of all. We don't have integration between different Meraki and Catalyst switches, so you cannot mix and match currently between Meraki switches and Catalyst switches, right? It's got to be a pure Meraki stack or a pure Catalyst stack is the only way that that's going to work out. But you can still have uplink ports from a Meraki stack that connect to uplink ports from a Cisco Catalyst if you want to do that, or access trunk ports on a Cisco Catalyst. So you can do that. And then on the miscellaneous side, the Meraki switches default their MTU to 9578. And so jumbo frames are basically configured and supported by default in the Meraki ecosystem. So just be aware of that that's what they want to do. And you want to make sure that that's consistent, right, throughout your entire switch infrastructure so that you don't run into fragmentation. Link negotiation is fine. Now, auto negotiate works in the vast majority of instances, as we all know, But if you're like me, you've always run into a situation where sometimes link negotiation doesn't work and you have to force it. So again, you have the ability to do that if you need to do that. We talked earlier about 8,000 ports in a network. The other number is 400 switches in a network. Again, most of you don't need to worry about that. Now, the Meraki switches support mgig. Well, some of the Meraki switches support mgig. And so it's very important to know that, mgig allows me to communicate at greater than 1 gigabit speeds over traditional Cat5e cable or Cat6a cable. But realistically, Cat6a is obviously the best one because there can be some crosstalk still that's going to occur if you're using the Cat5e cables. I use Cat5e and I get 2.5 gigabits pretty reliably in my Cat5e plant. But they're short runs as well. So that's probably a factor for me. So, that's another kind of thing to worry about. Now, specifically around the cat list, right, that Cisco's introducing, and I'm recognizing I only really have a few minutes left here. So Meraki announced at Cisco Live, or at least publicly announced at Cisco Live, that it was going to be possible to integrate a Catalyst switch into a Meraki dashboard panel. And there's two mechanisms. There's a monitoring mechanism and there's a management mechanism. Now, management includes monitoring. So monitoring only is designed for environments where you're going to continue to configure with your traditional mechanism, but for visibility and troubleshooting purposes, you want to have the ability to see what's going on with your devices and to use a familiar dashboard GUI as a way to troubleshoot and gain visibility into what's going on behind the scenes. Okay, so that's what monitoring means. So managed via normal and then monitored via the Meraki dashboard. Management means that you've gone all in on everything. You're monitoring and managing from the Meraki dashboard, and you will not use the command line again. Okay. Now, there has to be a different OS that runs on the Catalyst switches to allow management like that. Monitoring is simply just the addition of additional commands into the configuration of your switch. So monitoring gets you the centralized view, real-time health, application visibility, network topology, and of course, remote monitoring tools. So it's actually really nice. Just to have monitoring is good. And your Catalyst switches will show up just like your Meraki switches show up in the GUI interface, and you're able to click through and see all the panels that you've become comfortable with in the Meraki world. They'll now show for your Catalyst switches. It's a really amazing monitoring tool. And again, this is available broadly, 92s, 93s, 95s, as long as you've got iOS XE 17.3 or more. For the first year, the ability to do this is free. But going after the first year, you're expected to have a DNA Advantage or a DNA Essentials license. If you have the DNA Essentials license, you'll be able to monitor the switches. If you have the DNA Advantage license, you'll be able to monitor the switches and the clients connected to the switches. So that would be one of the benefits of having the Advantage license, is the ability to troubleshoot down to the individual client level. Now, you also can use Meraki, or let's say you will soon be able to use Meraki to manage your Catalyst switches as well. So you might be managing directly with command line, for example, in small environments. Larger environments, you might be using Cisco DNA Center. If you want to, you can migrate your Catalysts so that they become managed completely by the Meraki dashboard. Okay, so you can literally take it right up into the cloud and have it managed and monitored from the cloud. Now, obviously, it's a fairly sophisticated transition. You've got to upgrade to 17.8. Remember, 17.3 for monitoring, 17.8 for management. And there's a bunch of steps where you register the Catalyst into the cloud, you receive a serial number, you basically start the Meraki service, and you literally end up completely redoing the switch and standing it up as a cloud-managed device. So that's a really interesting capability. And there's a little bit more restrictions here, very specific models of the 9300. So that's the current compatibility, very specific models of the 9300. You can see the list there. And also very specific modules of the 2300, of the 9300 as well. right? So it's more restrictive for full-on management. Now, this is expected to grow over time. So this is not the final list. It's the current initial list of compatibility for management purposes, okay? And then the final thing I'll say about the Meraki radios is that, as I said before, there is no common controller for a Cisco Catalyst access point and a Cisco Meraki access point. So we've got a wireless LAN controller or a Catalyst controller oriented platform versus a cloud oriented platform. So there's really no integration. It's like you're going to operate one or the other, or you can operate both, but they should not overlap at all if you operate both, is really the baseline recommendation. And that's really all I'm going to say about the wireless, because I'm noticing that my time's gotten really short here. Absolutely. And there is a question here. So the end user is a hotel. How would you configure to have separate VoIP and video, fixed devices, guest access? Oh, okay. So you're talking about Wi-Fi access at a hotel. You've got Meraki's, and you want to split out the, basically you want to split out your SSIDs is what you're talking about. And, you know, there's a couple ways to do that, right? I mean, we typically recommend that you have no more than 3 SSIDs that are being advertised in your, really in any wireless world. That's really ideal. Typically there's one for guest, there's one for data, and then there's going to be one probably for voice and video. So you could, based on what I'm seeing here, probably survive with that. So a corporate SSID, a guest SSID, and then a media like voice video SSID. And that's probably like the simplest way for you to implement it in the description that you've given me, Spencer. There are alternatives where if you want to get really sophisticated, you can do identity services engine. We can do client identification. We could do tagging of the traffic based on group and user membership. And we can use those tags or group tags as a way to identify people. And we could do 10, 20, 30 different ways of slicing and dicing traffic if we were to use group tags to implement that. But that would typically be only if you really required it, would I bother looking at security group tags. Other than that, I think you're probably within the 3 AP limit that we were thinking about. So Spencer, I hope that answered your question. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And good luck with it. I love hotels. I hope that you have a lot of fun doing that deployment. Get some free rooms. Enjoy yourself. Okay, and I don't see any other questions that are showing up here, so I think we're good. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening, a great rest of the week, and we hope to see you around here sometime again at sunset. Take care.
If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification icon to get notified whenever we upload new content.